Good Italian Catholic boys always listened to their mother, and Kansas City native George Cosconi was no exception.
I was a mommy's boy. My dad died when I was 11, so she was my mother and my father. I did everything my mom wanted me to do.
That included getting his mother's approval when it came to girls. So in September 1969, when a friend introduced 17-year-old George to a young beauty named Dorothy Luther, he immediately brought her home to meet his mother. Dorothy was sweet and shy, and George's mom took an instant liking to the girl.
My mom took her under her wing, more or less, and her and my mom were almost like best friends.
Under his mother's approving eye, George and Dorothy formed a close friendship, one that soon blossomed into love.
She was real quiet. She was real good looking. I was drawn to her because she had the same values that I had, and family and home and things like that.
My sister told me she found this fabulous guy. He had a great family, and that he would take care of her. This was like her knight in shining armor.
In the summer of 1973, George and Dorothy decided it was high time they made it official. That August, the two were married by the Justice of the Peace, with a few close friends and family in attendance.
Just had a couple of people. My mom was there, one of my best friends. I was happy. It was anticipation, a new life together.
My sister was extremely eager to get married. It was like a mission. George seemed nervous, a little edgy, but my sister, she was on her game. She was ready to go.
After their honeymoon, the newlyweds easily slipped into the peaceful routine of marriage. Dorothy was a doting wife who worked at a local restaurant, while George finished college and worked several jobs.
We lived in my mom's house and saved money to buy a house. She was a good wife. We very seldom argued or fought. She was very, very quiet, very reserved. I worked in a grocery store, and I also worked in a body shop and had a job selling real estate. My mom raised me to work, and that's what I did.
In 1976, the young couple welcomed a baby girl into the world. And by the following year, George bought his new family their own home. But shortly after the birth of their daughter, George began to glimpse a different side of his once loving wife.
Dorothy had changed. She used to be real quiet and, reserved. She became more vocal, very opinionated, very, dominating, controlling.
Dorothy also seemed utterly indifferent to George's personal belongings.
It was gradual. I noticed my stuff started dwindling. I'd have a few keepsake items on the shelf, and she would just box it all up and put it in the garage. I asked her, I said, where's this, where's that? She goes, oh, I'll get it out. I can't do it right now. I'll do that later. Later never happened.
George wished his wife would be more considerate, but he had no time to wallow. As the household bills piled up, George worked even longer hours, while Dorothy constantly berated him.
All I was doing was working. There was no winning. She'd say, what are you gonna do with these bills? She'd bring a big stack of bills out and she says, what are you gonna do? Made me feel like the lowest thing on the planet.
George tried to keep his chin up and continue doing what he thought best for his family. But as the years went on, Dorothy's behavior went from bad to worse to outright horrifying. On the evening of July 5th, 2010, George was entertaining friends at home when suddenly around midnight there was a knock at his front door.
I went to the door and it was the police and the FBI. And they asked me to step out and talk to them, and I asked them what they were here for.
We explained to him what had been going on with Dorothy. We began to believe that she was going to follow through with her plan. She referred to the entire thing as a game.
She thought she was above the law.
In the spring of 1979, 31 years before George Cosconi received some shocking news, he was working hard to provide a good life for his wife Dorothy and their 3-year-old daughter.
I was always double jobbing it, always working all the time. I want to make sure they didn't long for something or feel like they were doing without.
George was thriving in his professional life, he took on a string of rental properties and buildings, and money finally began coming in. But the road to marital bliss was becoming bumpier than ever.
She controlled everything I did. She used to be real quiet and, reserved. Now she's just 180 degrees the other way.
And by 1984, after their second daughter was born, another set of problems surfaced.
The spending is where it really kind of started. It seemed like the spending just would spiral out of control. It was crazy.
Dorothy would buy anything and everything. She loved to buy shoes, clothes, and anything shiny or glittery. Or if it had a leopard print on it, she was all for it.
I told her we had to put the brakes on the credit cards. She just went into a rage and just started ransacking the place. She started knocking everything over, tearing everything up, just going totally bonkers. So I just backed off.
George decided to focus on keeping the peace with his wife, but Dorothy seemed to have other plans. One night in June of 1985, George came home to find his wife fuming over an unsigned insurance claim check.
A big hailstorm hit Kansas City. When the check came for the hail damage, I didn't see it. And when I got home, she goes, "You didn't sign that check." She made it sound like I wouldn't sign it, like it was something that was my fault. She got so mad.
But there was more to the story. Dorothy finally admitted that she had tried to cash the check anyway.
She just told me she was in a hurry. She ran to the bank, stuffed it in the teller's face, and they wouldn't cash it because it wasn't signed. So she was mad.
Dorothy's insatiable appetite for money was troubling. Still, George did his best to keep his marriage together. But the distance between the couple only grew. That same year, a frustrated and demoralized George sought comfort in the arms of a close friend.
I just wanted to find a little happiness for myself, but I didn't feel good about it. Dorothy found out about the affair. She was enraged. I did apologize to her numerous times, but it just made her more enraged to talk about it.
By now, George knew the way to his wife's heart was through his wallet.
I just threw more money at it, just let her have more control of my money. I did hope things would get better.
By the summer of 1986, things finally seemed to be looking up. George opened his own auto body shop in Kansas City, and Dorothy offered to do her part for the family business.
She was there all the time. She paid all the bills and wrote all the checks and took care of everything.
George hoped the joint venture would help their marriage. But by the end of that year, he began noticing large amounts of money missing from his business.
I was working 20 hours a day and still broke, and I knew that some of the dealership accounts were 10, 12 grand a month. I mean, I should have had more money.
George had a sinking feeling his wife was stealing from him.
I just kind of turned a blind eye to it. I thought that I owed it to her for what I'd done, having the affair.
So in 1991, George suggested that Dorothy open her own business, a wig salon, in one of his properties.
Well, I had hoped that she would be able to make enough money to be able to support her lifestyle the way she wanted to.
But over time, it became clear that Dorothy had no intention of leaving George's bank account alone.
She just always took my money to run her business. She paid all her employees out of my checking account. She paid her utilities and her insurance out of my checking account. I just tolerated it because I felt like I owed it to her for what I did. I tried to pay her back every way I could.
I think my sister is probably the most greedy person I've ever known in my life. She just has to have everything. It was almost like a game to her.
By 1996, the couple's already strained relationship only got worse when George's mother became ill. When she passed away 3 years later, the last remaining connection George and Dorothy had was severed.
Almost immediately, she served me with the final divorce papers. She was more revealing in her hostility after my mom died.
With his troubled marriage finally over, George set his sights on a more peaceful future. But things with Dorothy weren't over just yet. In fact, they were about to get much, much worse.
When I found out she sold his body to science, I was just in shock.
She had transformed into a monster.
In the summer of 1999, after a 26-year tumultuous marriage, George and his wife Dorothy Casconi called it quits. Despite everything, George was determined to make sure Dorothy wanted for nothing.
In the divorce, I let her have numerous properties, all my car collection, and everything that I had, all the houses, everything. Felt like I had to protect her.
There was just one thing George wanted to hold on to: his mother's house.
I wanted to keep that. I built that house with my mom in 1965, and I designed it. The house meant a lot to me. It was a very sentimental place to me.
But George didn't know that Dorothy had plans of her own.
She got my mother's house. When I signed off the rental properties to her, she attached the legal description to those documents as if I had signed it off with the other rental properties. And so she successfully got it from me lock, stock, and barrel. I felt real stupid. That was one of the things I cherished the most.
It's a big control issue with her because she wants to be totally in control of everything. And it was just important to her. It's almost like to be superior.
Even worse, shortly after their divorce, Dorothy remarried. George decided it was time to play hardball.
When I bought a new building, she wanted to put her wig shop in there real bad. She says, "Is there anything I can do to get my business in your new building?" You know, rent-free, of course. And I said, "I think you want something from me. I want something from you. You can sign me back on my mom's house." And she just was kind of taken aback by it.
But ultimately, the deal was too sweet for Dorothy to resist. And in 2002, she reluctantly agreed to George's terms. George hoped the battles with his ex-wife were now over. But by 2006, tensions between George and Dorothy reached a new level.
Dorothy was struggling in her business. She wasn't focused on her business. She was more focused on her image.
I got tired of paying the taxes. I sold the building, so she had to get completely out. She was real mad and outraged. It was one of the best things I ever did. She finally ended up moving her business into her house. So at that point, effectively, she was what they call belly up.
George was relieved to wash his hands of his irresponsible ex, especially when he got wind of a disturbing bit of news. In 2009, Dorothy's second husband passed away. Everyone was horrified to discover what Dorothy did with his body.
Immediately, she sold his body to science so that she could get the money for that and she wouldn't have to pay for a funeral to cut the expenses. I think you get something like $250 or something like that. I mean, it's so minimal, it's crazy. I was just in shock.
She talked about it several times. She talked about doing the same thing with George. It's a cheap way out. I was angry. I was angry for his family.
She's very methodical. I felt really lucky I got divorced when I did.
By 2010, George had finally moved on, leaving the ugly memory of his ex-wife's scheming behind. Until July 5th, when George had some unexpected visitors.
I was at home with my friends here. We were just hanging around. It was late at night, around 12:30, and somebody was knocking on the door. I went to the door, and it was the police and the FBI.
We wanted to let George know what was going on and what we had done to protect his safety. We asked him to step outside.
They said, "We have something to tell you. Did you make anybody mad recently?" And I said, "Well, in my business, I make a lot of people mad." And they said, "Well, what about in the past?"
George answered with the one person he knew disliked him in all of Kansas City.
And I immediately knew it was my ex-wife. And they said, "Well, we have her in custody down for a murder for hire plot to have you killed." I was surprised to think that she would hate me that much after I had helped her.
But that was just the beginning. What really floored George was how Dorothy had gone about her insidious plan.
She hired a thief to do a killer's work. She hired the wrong kind of criminal.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On July 5th, 2010, George Cascone was standing on his doorstep dumbfounded as federal agents and local police delivered some unbelievable news.
They said, well, we have your ex-wife in custody now for a murder for hire plot to have you killed.
Investigators went on to say that Dorothy Cascone had attempted to hire a hitman to do away with George. But instead of doing the job, the hitman went straight to the FBI.
He had known Dorothy for several weeks and had somewhat of a relationship with her. He believed that this was a credible threat.
The would-be hitman told the FBI that Dorothy wanted George shot around midnight on the 4th of July.
She wanted it done on that day because of the fireworks that were going off for the 4th of July, and she believed that this would minimize any kind of other individual hearing what was going on. He provided 3 handwritten drawings that Dorothy had given him of the different levels of the home, a .38 caliber handgun that was loaded.
He also told the FBI that Dorothy offered him $2,000 to kill George. The FBI immediately contacted the Kansas City Police Department, and together they planned an undercover sting operation using the informant.
We provided this individual with the recorder, and he was then sent back to Dorothy Cascone's home. He asked Dorothy, "How do you want George shot? 1 times, 2 times?" She responded, "I don't care, I just want him dead." After the money exchange and the loaded weapons and hearing the conversations, we were confident there was an actual threat to George.
The FBI and police wasted no time. They arrested Dorothy and charged her with first-degree assault.
My older niece called me and said, "You need to turn the TV on. Mom's on TV." And I said, "What channel?" I thought, gosh, she's really done a good job this time.
After the FBI informed George of Dorothy's arrest, a news crew showed up at his home later that day. And he was not shy in expressing how he felt.
The part that insulted me the most is the fact she was going to pay the hitman so little money. I mean, $2,000 is just not enough money.
George also had a little piece of advice for his ex-wife.
She should have took somebody from out of town, Chicago or New York, and she should have paid them at least 10 grand. 2 grand is not enough to get that kind of work done right. So instead, she get what you pay for.
She hired a thief to do a killer's work. She hired the wrong kind of criminal.
Shortly after his ex-wife's arrest, George learned that Dorothy had several life insurance policies she had taken out in his name. If her plan had gone off without a hitch, she could have inherited close to $1 million.
She would have ended up with this house, my buildings, and I guess $1 million almost.
On March 29, 2011, Dorothy Cascone pleaded guilty to second-degree assault. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
I was pretty shocked for what she had done. I thought that was a pretty light sentence.
When someone who's never had any control and never had any money, and you suddenly give them power and control, they can't handle it. It goes to their head. She wanted to call all the shots on everything, and for a long time she did, and I allowed it.
Today, George is still struggling to move past everything that happened, so he focuses most of his energy on his business and his beloved granddaughter.
I don't have to work 20 hours a day. I don't have somebody stealing money from me constantly. I get to see my granddaughter more now, and I get to build a relationship with her. That's important.
George is still pretty much himself. That's one of the things I like. He doesn't put on this fake persona. He remains true to who he is.
Still, George admits that forming new relationships has been tough.
I'd never get married again. When you get married, you give someone the legal right to totally jack you over. I mean, it's like, here, take everything. Here's my keys. I surrender. I can't do that for anybody now.
Andrea Merriman always knew that money couldn't buy happiness.
I grew up in a very financially prosperous but down-to-earth family. And I remember as a teenager when my dad died unexpectedly in a plane crash, and I saw his Mercedes sitting in the driveway, and it hit me clearly, wow, this life really isn't about money, and you can't take it with you.
But even though she wasn't focused on material things, Andrea was practical and wise beyond her 20 years when it came to love.
I remember when I was a teenager making out a list of what I would want someday in my future husband. The three most important qualities for me would have been faith, their ability to provide for myself and my future family, and then how they treated me.
So in the fall of 1988, when most of her female peers at Brigham Young University were chasing handsome athletes, Andrea was looking for a man with more enduring qualities. And she found them in a fellow student named Sean Merriman.
Sean was a very, very nice, honest guy. And I realized the more I talked to him how very intelligent he was. He was kind of a student entrepreneur and started his own custom home stereo installation company and did very well. And he was generous with what he had.
Like Andrea, Sean was a member of the Mormon Church, and she was instantly drawn to him.
Sean was the first guy I dated that could do all those Hollywood romantic gestures and make them seem real, not cheesy. I thought he was the dream man that I'd been looking for.
I was very excited for her. I thought they got along really well.
It seemed Sean thought so too. And in the spring of 1989, after 6 months of dating, he proposed. And Andrea said yes. 3 months later, Sean and Andrea were wed at the Mormon Temple.
Our wedding day was a great day. It was happy, it was full of hope and promise for the future.
In April of 1990, the newlyweds packed up and moved to Denver, Colorado, where Sean would pursue a master's degree in business.
When we got to Denver, he began his job as an investment banker and realized he didn't need an MBA to do that job. He worked for 3 months and made $50,000.
Pretty soon, other companies were courting Sean and offering him signing bonuses of up to $80,000 to switch firms.
I think that he appealed to employers because he was very smart and he was very sure of himself.
Within a year, Sean was making a lot of money, and he was spending a lot too.
Well, Sean brought expensive taste to our marriage. I think that in Sean's mind, he had missed out on some things in his childhood, whether it be financial or emotional. And I think it meant a lot to him to be able to finally have those things that he had dreamed of. I figured as long as our basic needs were met and we were, not having priorities that were too worldly or too messed up, then we were doing okay.
But 20 years later, Andrea would learn the devastating truth about her husband's real priorities. And this revelation would shatter their picture-perfect family life. On March 18, 2009, Andrea was out running errands when her cell phone rang. It was her husband, Sean.
Sean asked me what I was doing, and he said, "I was hoping to spend time with you this morning." So I turned the car around and drove home and met him at our house. And when I walked into the room he was in, he was on the phone with someone. So I sat at the table and waited while he finished his conversation.
When Sean hung up the phone, he turned to Andrea and revealed a devastating secret he'd been keeping from her for over a decade.
I felt like I had been thrust in the biggest, blackest, deepest, darkest hole, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of it.
I thought, this can't be really true. This can't be happening to this family.
As soon as we heard about it, we knew this was going to be a huge story.
In the spring of 1993, 16 years before a devastating secret destroyed her life, Andrea Merriman and her husband Sean were well on their way to building their American dream.
In April, we had our first child. So we moved to a custom-built home in a neighborhood where all the homes were on 1 to 3 acres. So it was kind of a dream come true.
Sean's hard work was paying off, and Andrea was enjoying the benefits.
As soon as she started having children, she stayed home, and that became her career.
Andrea initially tried her hand at managing the family finances, but it soon became clear that money was Sean's territory.
Sean brought in the money, and Sean paid all of the bills. I didn't know what obligations we had. We decided it just worked better for him to be in charge.
Sean took care of most of the finances. I think that's what he did well. He made sure everybody had even more than they wanted. He provided for his kids very well.
As the months went by, Sean's career seemed to skyrocket, and in the fall of 1993, he told Andrea about a big business decision he had made.
So he told me that he had some clients who had asked him to leave the investment banking business and manage money privately for them.
Sean opened his company, Market Street Advisors, in 1994. He built an office in the basement of the family home. With a separate entrance he always kept locked. The very nature of Sean's business meant keeping his wife in the dark when it came to his work.
We set up some ground rules that the basement was off limits to my children and I in the day, and that's how he was able to work and run his business. I never knew any specific details as to who his clients were or how much money they had invested. I am a great believer in privacy, and other people's money is not my business.
Only once, shortly after starting his business, Sean confided in Andrea about a work-related concern.
He had been puzzled and stressed for a few days. I could just tell something was bothering him. He was quiet. I asked him what was wrong, and he just said, "Oh, it's just something, I'll take care of it. I have a problem at work. I just need to figure out how to solve it."
Sean explained to Andrea that the source of his stress was an accounting problem he had been struggling to resolve.
And then a few days later, he came to me and said, "Oh, I'm so relieved. I figured out how to solve my accounting problem." And I thought, okay, everything will be fine.
Over the next several years, Sean's income grew as steadily as his family. By 2005, Sean and Andrea were the parents of 4 children. And Sean had taken on a prestigious role of bishop at their church.
When Sean became a bishop for our church, it was a big deal. You're only called to be a bishop if you're a very worthy member.
Andrea was proud of her upstanding husband. In fact, the only contention between the two was Sean's increasingly ostentatious spending.
Sean enjoyed buying all different kinds of things. Cars had always been a passion. He bought Ferraris, Porsches, all kinds of luxury cars. He bought art. Sean built a building behind our home that was almost 5,000 square feet. It was massive. He had his showroom, and it was a giant room that had all of his animal trophies from around the world. And it had art storage, it had everything, that he could possibly want. And it was more than a man cave, it was his man palace.
Andrea had no choice but to accept Sean's expensive hobbies. It never even crossed her mind that behind her husband's insatiable appetite for luxury was a problem much more disturbing than overspending.
When he started to cry, I realized, oh my gosh, I think this is real.
It was like pulling a rug out from under her feet.
In the spring of 2005, Andrea Merriman was beginning to feel uncomfortable with her husband Sean's extravagant spending habits, even though Sean could very well afford his expensive tastes.
Sean's business was continuing to do very, very well, and many people were approaching him to manage their money. I think he was at the height of his success.
And even though Sean didn't discuss business with his wife, Andrea didn't mind giving him his privacy in that respect.
My husband had a business, and he dealt in issues that were private and confidential. And he told me it wasn't my business, and I agreed that it wasn't my business, so it didn't bother me at all.
But one day, when Andrea picked up Sean's open laptop to check her email, she was taken aback by his reaction.
He was very uncomfortable with that and told me, "What are you doing? You shouldn't be on my computer." And I was so surprised that he reacted that way. I just looked at him and said, "I cannot believe you. You have so much privacy in your life. You know, you have your own cell phone, you have your own office, you have your own building. You could be living a secret life for all I know." And he looked at me and said, "You're right, I'm sorry."
From that point on, Sean left his computer out in the open for Andrea to check whenever she wanted. Life for the couple carried on as usual, and Andrea was overjoyed when Sean told her he'd made the final mortgage payment on their house.
I know that having her house paid off gave her a sense of security, that she would always have a home for her children.
When Sean told me that our home was paid off, I was just happy. I had something that I'd wanted for a long time, and it represented security to me.
But by 2008, Andrea was feeling a little less secure in her marriage. Over the years, Sean's passion for material things had begun to overshadow his passion for his family. He spent more and more time away, buying art at auctions in London and shooting big game on safaris in Africa.
He was gone too much. Andrea had no support. I didn't think it was fair for him to go off on those long things by himself, and it was all about him.
On top of everything, when Sean was home, he seemed exceptionally cranky. Andrea chalked her husband's moodiness up to an ongoing IRS audit of his finances.
At some point, the IRS decided to audit him, and it took all of 2008. And Sean was getting more and more worked up about it and angry about it.
But when the audit uncovered nothing unusual, the Merrimans breathed a sigh of relief. Sean seemed to be back to his generous, good-natured self. And on March 13th, he sent Andrea off on a surprise trip to New York City with her girlfriends.
He arranged a room for us at an amazing hotel and had a limo pick me up at the airport. And we went to shows and just had a dream vacation.
While Andrea was away, she knew her husband Sean had been holed up in his office working his usual long hours. So when she returned home, Andrea was surprised to find their voicemail full of urgent messages.
They were all for Sean. Then my cell phone started receiving calls for Sean, which I thought was interesting, and clients were calling saying, "We're trying to reach Sean, where is he?" I really didn't know what was going on, so I just figured maybe he had bitten off more than he could chew, and he was a little behind in returning phone calls.
Andrea passed the messages on to Sean and went on with her routine. She thought everything was fine until March 18th, 2009.
I was headed out to run errands, and Sean called me on my cell phone, and he said, "I was hoping to spend time with you this morning." And I thought, that's kind of odd. It should be a work day, but I figured I'd been out of town, life had been busy, and maybe he just needed to talk. So I turned the car around and drove home and met him at our house. And when I walked into the room he was in, he was on the phone with someone, which was not unusual. So I sat at the table and waited while he finished his conversation. So when he got off the phone, he sat down across from me at the table.
Andrea was not at all prepared for the words that came out of Sean's mouth next.
And he looked at me without emotion and said, "My company is a sham."
Sean Merriman basically stole $20 million from investors.
It's something that you see on TV. It's not something that you live through or watch other people live through.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In March of 2009, Andrea Merriman's husband Sean sat her down and told her that the business he had been running for 15 years was a fake.
He wasn't emotional. He wasn't angry. He didn't look devastated. He just seemed very normal as he sat across the table from me and told me. He said, "My company, Market Street Advisors, is a sham. All these years that you thought that I was running an investment company, I've actually been running a Ponzi scheme." I really didn't understand what a Ponzi scheme was, and he told me that he was taking money from investors and then using that to live on, as well as pay other investors as they withdrew money, and that in reality, he hadn't bought or sold a stock in many years.
Sean told Andrea that he felt so guilty he had decided to turn himself in to authorities. All their possessions would be confiscated, and Sean knew he'd be going to prison.
And I remember saying, "Well, at least the house is paid off." And he said, "No, you don't understand. Our house is gone, our cars are gone, everything is gone. You're left with nothing. I'm sorry, you're on your own." So I believed all along I was living in a paid-off home, but it wasn't. It was mortgaged, I just didn't know it.
She went from having Rembrandt paintings on the wall to wondering how she was going to be able to feed her children dinner.
Sean Merriman's downfall quickly became front-page news.
Well, when the story broke after he turned himself in, it was a huge story in Denver because of the number of people that were impacted by it and the devastating results it had on so many people's lives. The Bernie Madoff story had been huge news, and so people were getting very familiar with the idea of a Ponzi scheme, but it felt very New York City, I think. And when it happened here in Colorado, it just took on a different meaning because it was happening close to home.
As more information leaked out, it became clear that Sean had bilked friends, fellow church members, and even family out of $20 million.
I had money with him that my mom had left me, and then it was gone. I felt like it was a betrayal of everything that we ever knew. I felt like we didn't even know him.
Sean Merriman frauded people out of their life savings, out of their retirement. He told them he was investing money and that their money was growing, and he was spending the money instead.
As Sean's elaborate web of lies continued to unravel, Andrea realized that she was right when she joked about him living a double life. She discovered the Ponzi scheme was Sean's solution to the minor accounting problem he encountered when he first started his business.
Eventually, I thought back to the conversation early in his investment company career when he'd had a problem and then he had solved it and said, "Okay, everything's going to be fine." And everything wasn't fine. From that moment on, it was like a bomb in our family, in our life, in our marriage that was ticking away, and I never even knew it was there.
Over the next 4 months, Andrea lived in agonizing limbo as Sean awaited his day in court, while still living at their family home.
I found out in a moment that I was living with a stranger. He anticipated being taken into custody within 6 to 7 weeks. So I thought I had 6 to 7 weeks to find a job, find a place to live, and try to find a life for my children and I.
In July of 2009, Andrea finalized her divorce from Sean, packed up her kids, and moved to Utah where she could start over.
Single mom, 4 children, 2 dogs, no house, no money, no prospects. I had a lot of misperceptions about me. I felt that I was being judged. And you just come to a point where you have to let it all go.
In December of 2009, Andrea watched from afar as Sean pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony mail fraud. 9 months later, on September 14, 2010, he was sentenced to 12.5 years in federal prison.
We talked to victims outside the courtroom who really said that no number of years was going to feel right or okay because so many people lost everything they had.
Today, Andrea Merriman is remarried and is a busy working mom juggling 4 children and a public relations job.
My life is very, very different now in many ways than it was when I was married to Sean. It's very, very different in the material aspect of things.
Andrea always knew that money isn't everything, and now she is happily living her dream without it.
We live in a small house. We drive old used cars. We don't go out to eat. We don't go out to movies. I mean, I don't have extras for anything, but it is a life that is equally as satisfying and equally as fulfilling.
The phone rings at 2:17 a.m., sharp and sudden, cutting through a Texas night that has been quiet for too long. And somewhere between the second and third ring, a detective who thought this case was buried forever realizes that the past has just found its way back into the present. Because cold cases don't stay cold. They wait, they watch, and when they come back, they don't knock politely, they break the door down. In the early summer of 2003, Texas was burning, not just with heat, but with the kind of tension that settles into small communities when something goes wrong and no one can explain it. When a face vanishes and leaves behind only rumors, half-truths, and a silence that grows heavier with every passing day. The town was the kind of place where people recognized each other's trucks by sound, where news traveled faster than police radios, and where a single unexplained absence could tilt the balance of an entire community. On a quiet stretch of road just outside town limits, something happened that night, something violent, something final, and when the sun came up, nothing felt normal anymore. The victim was not a stranger, not a drifter, not someone easy to forget, but a person whose name echoed through church halls, school parking lots, and local diners. A person with routines so predictable that when those routines were broken, everyone noticed at once. The car was found first, abandoned in a place where it did not belong, engine cold, doors unlocked, no sign of a struggle that made sense, just enough disorder to raise alarms without answering any questions. Inside, there were small details that didn't add up, a seat pushed back farther than usual, a personal item missing, another left behind, clues that whispered contradiction instead of clarity. By mid-morning, police tape cut across gravel and dust, and the word missing started to circulate, first cautiously, then urgently, and finally with the kind of fear that creeps into voices when people realize they might be dealing with more than a misunderstanding. Volunteers gathered. Flashlights came out even in daylight. Fields were walked. Ditches were searched. Dogs followed scents that twisted, doubled back, and vanished as if the ground itself had decided to keep a secret. This was Texas, after all, where land stretches wide and answers can disappear just as easily as people do. The investigation moved fast at first, too fast perhaps, driven by pressure, by eyes watching, by a community demanding reassurance that someone, somewhere, was in control. Interviews stacked up. Alibis were checked. Names were written, crossed out, written again. Friends, co-workers, former partners, anyone with even the faintest connection to the victim found themselves replaying their last conversations, wondering if they had missed something important, something fatal. Every tip sounded promising for about 5 minutes before collapsing under scrutiny. Every lead seemed solid until it wasn't. Then came the headlines. Texas 2003 cold case. Mysterious disappearance. Community on edge. The phrase cold case arrived early, too early, like a verdict delivered before the trial had even begun. It wasn't supposed to go that way. Detectives were confident, at least outwardly. They spoke of progress, of promising angles, of persons of interest who would surely crack under pressure. But behind closed doors, doubts multiplied. Evidence was thin. Timelines refused to align. Witness statements contradicted each other in ways that felt less like lies and more like fragments of a story no one fully understood. Weeks passed, then months. The searches slowed. The news vans left. The yellow tape came down. Life, at least on the surface, resumed its old rhythm. But underneath it all, something had shifted. The victim's name stopped appearing in daily conversation, but never fully disappeared. It lingered in the background, in the way people locked their doors a little earlier, in the way parents watched their children more closely, in the way silence fell whenever the case was mentioned. Investigators hit their first real wall before the end of that year. A potential suspect, once considered promising, was cleared after forensic tests came back negative. Another lead, built on a witness sighting, unraveled when phone records proved the timing impossible. A third angle, involving a personal dispute, collapsed under the weight of solid alibis and inconvenient facts. One by one, the pillars holding the case upright gave way, and by early 2004, the file was thick but hollow, heavy with paperwork, yet painfully light on truth. The case went cold not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet administrative decision, a reassignment here, a transfer there, a box slid onto a shelf where hundreds of others already waited. Officially, it remained open. Unofficially, it became something detectives mentioned with a sigh, a case that taught new recruits what failure looked like, what unanswered questions felt like when they followed you home at night. For the family, there was no such thing as cold. There was only absence, birthdays without celebration, holidays without laughter, and the constant, exhausting effort of remembering someone whose story had been interrupted without explanation. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA databases grew. Cold cases across the country began to stir, old evidence speaking for the first time through new methods. Every so often, hope flickered. A new detective would review the file, see something others had missed, make a call that went nowhere, send a sample that produced no match. Each time, the result was the same. Nothing. The silence stretched longer, heavier, until even hope began to feel like a liability. Then, nearly 2 decades later, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a routine update, a data entry, a comparison run through a system that didn't exist back in 2003. Somewhere, a piece of evidence that had been cataloged, sealed, and forgotten spoke up at last, and when it didn't whisper. It pointed. The match wasn't perfect, not definitive, but it was strong enough to make someone stop, reread the screen, and feel that familiar tightening in the chest that comes when instinct and data collide. A name resurfaced. Not a new one. An old one. Someone who had been interviewed early on, briefly, casually, before being dismissed as irrelevant, before slipping back into the background of the town, living a life that looked ordinary enough to avoid suspicion. 20 years earlier, there hadn't been enough. Now there might be. Detectives began moving carefully, aware that time was both their enemy and their ally. Memories fade, but patterns don't. People change, but the past has a way of clinging to them, waiting for the right moment to reassert itself. Surveillance followed. Records were pulled. Old statements were read alongside new behavior. What once seemed insignificant now looked different under the harsh light of hindsight. Small inconsistencies, once ignored, started to form a shape. Not proof, not yet, but a story that could be tested, challenged, and if strong enough, brought into the open. When the arrest finally came, it didn't happen in the dead of night or under flashing lights for the cameras. It happened quietly, efficiently, almost respectfully, as if everyone involved understood the weight of what was unfolding. 20 years after the disappearance that shattered a Texas town, a suspect was in custody, and the words "cold case reopened" surged back into headlines with a force that felt both shocking and inevitable. But an arrest is not an ending. It is a question, asked out loud for the first time in decades. Did they finally find the right person, or was this just another chapter in a story defined by uncertainty? In Texas, in that town where memory runs long and trust runs thin, people listened to the news with a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that whatever came next would force them to confront a past they had never truly escaped. And as investigators prepared to lay out their case, one truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. After 20 years of silence, the cold case had awakened, and it would not go back to sleep quietly. The arrest didn't bring closure, it brought noise, the kind of noise that rattles through a town long after the sirens fade, because an answer after 20 years doesn't arrive as relief, it arrives as disruption, tearing open wounds that had learned to scar over in silence. In coffee shops and parking lots, in group texts and late-night phone calls, the same question echoed again and again. How could someone live among us all this time? How could the truth sit this close without being seen? How could a cold case breathe unnoticed for 2 decades before suddenly standing up and demanding attention? Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Old maps came down from storage. Evidence bags were unsealed under sterile lights. Reports written by detectives now retired, some dead, were reread with fresh eyes, their margins filled with new notes, new doubts, new urgency. The case file no longer felt like history. It felt alive, volatile, capable of changing direction at any moment. Every decision mattered now, because the margin for error had evaporated with the years. The suspect's name traveled fast, faster than officials wanted, faster than they could control. People remembered him differently, depending on who you asked. To some, he was quiet, forgettable, the kind of man who blended into the background by design. To others, there had always been something off, a look held a second too long, a temper that flared when challenged, a reputation that never quite turned into proof. Back in 2003, none of it had been enough. Not without evidence. Not without a timeline that could hold under pressure. Investigators went back to the beginning, to that night when everything fractured, and replayed it second by second, minute by minute, refusing to skip ahead, refusing to assume anything was settled. They rebuilt the victim's final hours, tracing movements through phone pings that barely existed at the time, through witness statements that now sounded different when stripped of context and re-examined. A stop that once seemed casual now felt deliberate. A delay once blamed on traffic now looked like opportunity. Then there was the evidence, the fragment that had survived years of storage, heat, humidity, and neglect, waiting for technology to catch up. Back then, it had been labeled inconclusive, filed away with a shrug. Now, enhanced, compared, contextualized, it suggested contact that should not have happened, proximity that could no longer be explained away. It wasn't the smoking gun the public imagined, but it was enough to redraw the map of suspicion. The suspect denied everything, calmly, predictably, as if he had rehearsed the moment long before it arrived. He spoke of routine, of ordinary days, of nothing unusual, his words smooth, his tone measured. He had lived with this question mark long enough to know how to answer without answering, how to offer detail without substance. Detectives listened, letting the silence stretch, watching for cracks that might appear when time pressed in from all sides. Outside, the victim's family faced a different kind of interrogation, one carried out by memory and hope rather than police. They revisited old photographs, old arguments, old regrets, wondering if justice delayed could still be justice, wondering if knowing would be better than not knowing at all. 20 years of waiting had taught them caution. They had seen leads flare and die before. They had learned not to celebrate too early. As the case moved forward, another problem emerged, one that no amount of evidence could fully solve. Time had thinned the crowd of witnesses. Some had moved away. Some had forgotten details they once swore were unforgettable. Some had passed on, taking pieces of the puzzle with them. Investigators compensated the only way they could, by stacking small certainties on top of each other until they formed something solid enough to stand. They found inconsistencies in the suspect's past statements, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle shifts, a time adjusted here, a location softened there, the kind of changes that suggest memory under pressure rather than innocence preserved. They discovered connections that had seemed irrelevant years earlier, relationships that had been underestimated, tensions that had never been fully explored. What once looked like coincidence now hinted at pattern. The community watched from a distance, torn between wanting the story to end and fearing what that ending might reveal about themselves. If this suspect was guilty, what did it say about the years spent living alongside him, about the trust extended without question, about the warning signs dismissed as nothing more than small-town gossip? If he was innocent, what did it say about the desperation to close a chapter that had refused to close on its own? Court filings followed. Motions, requests for additional testing. Every step forward met resistance, not just from defense attorneys doing their job, but from the sheer weight of a case that had grown brittle with age. Evidence had to be authenticated, chains of custody proven, assumptions justified. The past demanded accountability from the present, and it did not accept shortcuts. In late nights and early mornings, detectives felt the familiar pull of doubt. Cold cases have a way of humbling even the most confident investigators. They whisper warnings about certainty, about narratives that feel right but fall apart under scrutiny. Yet something about this case refused to retreat. The more they questioned it, the more it held its shape. The more pressure they applied, the more details aligned instead of scattering. The suspect remained in custody, his life abruptly paused, his future balanced on the interpretation of decades-old moments. He maintained his innocence, publicly and privately, his supporters insisting that memory is unreliable, that the justice system is imperfect, that reopening the past risks rewriting it. Critics countered that time favors the guilty, that delay erodes accountability, that if not now, then when? As news coverage intensified, the phrase, Texas 2003 cold case, resurfaced everywhere, a headline reborn, carrying with it the weight of unfinished business. National attention followed, analysts dissecting the investigation, armchair detectives drawing conclusions from fragments, social media turning speculation into spectacle. For those closest to the case, the noise was exhausting, a distraction from the careful, methodical work still underway behind closed doors. At the center of it all remained the unanswered question that had haunted the town since that hot summer night. What really happened, and why had it taken 20 years to ask the right question in the right way? The answer, whatever it was, lay ahead, tangled in testimony, technology, and truth, waiting to be pulled into the light. And as the case edged closer to a courtroom, one reality became impossible to ignore. Reopening a cold case doesn't just reopen a file. It reopens lives, dragging the past into the present and daring it to finally explain itself. The deeper investigators dug, the more the past resisted, like soil packed tight by years of pressure, refusing to give up what it had buried so carefully, because a cold case does not unravel neatly. It fights back, it distorts memory, it challenges certainty, and every answer it offers arrives wrapped in new questions. Inside the interview rooms, the lights felt harsher than before, the air heavier, as if the building itself understood the stakes had changed. This was no longer about revisiting history. This was about deciding whether history had been allowed to walk free for 20 years. Detectives returned again to the suspect's movements in 2003, reconstructing days that had once seemed unremarkable, days that now carried the weight of consequence. Work logs were compared against payroll records. Gas receipts were plotted against distance and time. Credit card swipes, primitive by today's standards, were scrutinized like ancient artifacts, each timestamp a fragile anchor in an ocean of uncertainty. What emerged was not a clear confession, not a dramatic revelation, but a narrowing corridor of possibility, a space where coincidence began to suffocate under its own improbability. One moment in particular refused to fade. A window of time, less than an hour, when the suspect could not be definitively placed anywhere else, when his story rested entirely on his own word. In 2003, that gap had been dismissed as insignificant, too small to matter, too ordinary to pursue. Now, framed by everything that followed, it looked enormous. Investigators circled it again and again, probing its edges, asking not just where he claimed to be, but why that explanation had never quite settled. They spoke to people who had known him then, voices older now, hesitant, burdened by the knowledge that what they said could alter a life. Some struggled to remember specifics, but emotion lingered where detail had faded. Unease, discomfort, a sense that something hadn't been right, even if they hadn't known how to name it at the time. Others defended him fiercely, offended by the implication that familiarity could mask guilt, insisting that 20 years of freedom had to mean something. The investigators listened to all of it, weighing tone as much as testimony. Meanwhile, the evidence continued to evolve. What had once been labeled contamination was reconsidered. What had once been ignored as noise was re-examined for signal. Advances in forensic science allowed analysts to extract meaning from fragments that would have been useless 2 decades earlier. Each result came with caveats, probabilities, margins of error, but taken together, they told a story of contact, of presence, of something shared between victim and suspect that demanded explanation. The defense pushed back hard. They spoke of tunnel vision, of the danger of fitting facts to a narrative after so much time had passed. They reminded anyone who would listen that memory degrades, that evidence ages, that the justice system is not designed to reach backward indefinitely without risk. They argued that reopening a cold case is as much about hope as it is about truth, and that hope can distort as easily as it can illuminate. Inside the sheriff's office, doubts crept in during the quiet hours. Detectives asked themselves the questions no one outside ever hears. Are we right, or are we desperate? Are we seeing clarity, or are we manufacturing it from fragments because we want an ending? Cold cases breed these fears because they live at the intersection of patience and obsession. Yet every time they stepped back, every time they tried to dismantle their own theory, it refused to collapse. Instead, it adjusted, adapted, held together in ways that felt stubbornly real. The victim's final movements began to sharpen into focus. A conversation that had once seemed mundane now read like a turning point. A decision that had appeared impulsive now looked calculated. Investigators traced emotional currents as carefully as physical ones, mapping stress, conflict, fear, and trust, the invisible forces that guide people into dangerous situations without realizing it. They asked not just how the victim disappeared, but why they had been vulnerable at that precise moment. The suspect's reactions changed subtly as the case progressed. Not dramatically, not enough to satisfy those craving spectacle, but there were pauses where none had existed before. Corrections to earlier statements, framed as clarifications. An edge of irritation when certain topics resurfaced, as if the past itself were an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. Detectives noted everything, knowing that consistency over time often speaks louder than any single interview. Outside, the community's patience wore thin. Some demanded swift justice, convinced that 20 years was already too long to wait. Others urged restraint, warning against the irreversible consequences of a wrong accusation. The town split along lines that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with belief, with trust in institutions, with personal experiences of loss and betrayal. The case stopped being just about one disappearance and became a mirror, reflecting fears about safety, accountability, and the limits of forgiveness. As prosecutors prepared their strategy, they faced a brutal reality. Convincing a jury would mean convincing 12 people to travel back in time, to understand a world before smartphones, before constant surveillance, before digital footprints made lies easier to catch. They would have to explain why the case had stalled, why it had taken 20 years to reach this point, without allowing that delay to undermine the credibility of the conclusion. It was a delicate balance, one misstep away from collapse. The suspect sat at the center of it all, his life suspended between past and future, insisting on innocence, watching as strangers dissected his history for meaning he denied existed. Whether he was guilty or not, one truth was undeniable. The cold case had claimed him too, dragging his name into headlines, stripping away anonymity, forcing him to answer for a night he claimed had been no different from any other. As preparations continued, investigators reached a quiet understanding among themselves. There would be no perfect ending here. No confession that tied everything into a neat bow. No revelation that erased the years of uncertainty. What they were chasing now was not perfection, but accountability, a chance to replace silence with something closer to truth. And as the case moved inexorably forward, one question loomed larger than all the rest, heavy with consequence and impossible to ignore. After 20 years of waiting, was the truth finally strong enough to survive the light? Time became the enemy in ways no one could control, not just the years that had already passed, but the hours now slipping away as the case edged closer to a courtroom. Because every day that moved forward carried the risk of losing something else, a memory fading, a witness hesitating, a detail dissolving into uncertainty. Investigators felt it constantly, a pressure behind the eyes, a reminder that reopening a cold case is not about chasing the past, it is about racing it. They returned to the physical landscape, to the roads and fields that had framed the disappearance, standing where the victim had last been seen, letting the environment speak in ways reports never could. The distance between locations felt different now, shorter, more connected, as if the land itself had been misjudged 20 years earlier. What once seemed too far to matter now appeared reachable, plausible, dangerously convenient. A turn that had been dismissed as insignificant now looked like a decision point, a place where something could have gone wrong very quickly. Witnesses were re-interviewed, not to extract new facts, but to understand old ones. Investigators listened for hesitation, for certainty that had eroded, for confidence that had grown where none had existed before. Some people surprised them, recalling details they had never mentioned in 2003, not because they were hiding anything then, but because time had rearranged their understanding of what mattered. Others shut down entirely, overwhelmed by the realization that their words could now carry consequences they had never imagined. The victim's voice, absent for 2 decades, began to emerge indirectly, through messages, through patterns of behavior, through decisions made in the days leading up to the disappearance. Investigators studied tone, timing, emotional context, asking what had been weighing on the victim, what pressures had been building quietly, unseen by those closest to them. It became clear that this was not a random vanishing, not a moment of chaos, but something shaped by relationships and trust, by choices made under assumptions that proved fatal. The suspect's history came under renewed scrutiny, not just his movements that night, but his reactions afterward. Investigators examined how he had responded when the disappearance first made headlines, what he had said, what he had not said, how quickly he had moved on when others were still searching fields and ditches. At the time, his behavior had seemed unremarkable, one more concerned citizen among many. Now, viewed through the lens of what followed, it raised uncomfortable questions about distance and detachment. Defense attorneys seized on the ambiguity, highlighting every gap, every assumption, every place where certainty gave way to probability. They painted a picture of an investigation shaped by hindsight, arguing that patterns only emerge when someone decides where to look. They reminded anyone listening that a cold case reopened carries the risk of becoming a story people want to believe, not necessarily one that can be proven beyond doubt. Behind the scenes, prosecutors wrestled with the emotional weight of the case. They knew what it represented, not just for the victim's family, but for the credibility of the system itself. Bringing charges after 20 years meant standing behind every decision made by those who came before, explaining delays, justifying missed opportunities, acknowledging mistakes without allowing them to overshadow the evidence now on the table. It was a balancing act with no safety net. As preparations intensified, the suspect's demeanor shifted again, subtly but noticeably. He grew more guarded, less willing to elaborate, as if realizing that every word now lived in a permanent record, subject to endless replay and interpretation. Interviews became exercises in patience, long stretches of silence punctuated by carefully chosen phrases. Detectives allowed it, understanding that pressure does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from simply letting someone sit with their own story. Outside the legal process, the town continued to wrestle with itself. Old arguments resurfaced. Long-settled grudges found new fuel. People questioned whether justice delayed could ever feel just, whether reopening wounds was worth the possibility of closure. For some, the arrest validated years of suspicion. For others, it felt like an accusation aimed at the entire community, a suggestion that they had failed to protect one of their own. Media attention sharpened the edges of every development. Headlines condensed complexity into punchy phrases. Speculation filled the gaps left by official silence. The words "cold case" carried a strange power now, both a promise and a warning, a reminder that time does not erase truth, but it does complicate it. Every update pulled the past closer, refusing to let it remain safely out of reach. In quiet moments, investigators revisited the central question that had driven them from the start. Not just who, but why? Why this victim? Why this night? Why this delay? The answers were not simple, and they did not align neatly with the narratives people preferred. They spoke of opportunity, of familiarity, of the dangerous comfort that comes from assuming you know someone well enough to trust them without question. As the case pressed forward, one reality became impossible to ignore. Whether the suspect was ultimately convicted or not, the reopening of the Texas 2003 cold case had already changed everything. It had exposed the fragility of certainty, the persistence of unanswered questions, and the unsettling truth that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how much time passes. And as the courtroom loomed on the horizon, heavy with expectation, the town braced itself for a confrontation with its own history, knowing that whatever came next would echo far beyond a single verdict. As the case edged closer to trial, the weight of expectation pressed down on everyone involved, a pressure that felt physical, like humidity before a storm, because this was no longer just about proving guilt or innocence. It was about whether truth could still be extracted from something that had been allowed to decay for 20 years. Inside preparation rooms and offices lit by late-night desk lamps, timelines were taped to walls, redrawn, torn down, rebuilt again, each version an attempt to impose order on a past that resisted structure. Prosecutors focused on narrative, not the sensational kind, but the quiet, relentless story built from accumulation, from repetition, from details that refused to contradict each other no matter how many times they were tested. They knew they could not rely on a single moment to carry the case. There would be no dramatic confession, no eyewitness stepping forward at the last second. What they had instead was convergence, multiple lines pointing inward, tightening around the suspect until coincidence began to look implausible. They rehearsed how to explain the delay without apologizing for it, how to describe the limitations of 2003 without excusing them, how to show that progress did not invalidate the past, but illuminated it. Every sentence had to walk a narrow line, acknowledging uncertainty while asserting confidence, respecting doubt without surrendering to it. In a cold case, tone matters as much as evidence, because jurors are not just weighing facts, they are deciding whether to trust the process that brought those facts to light. The defense prepared a different story, one centered on erosion, on the idea that time itself was the real suspect, that memories degrade, evidence ages, and certainty becomes an illusion. They planned to emphasize what was missing rather than what remained, to highlight every lost record, every deceased witness, every unanswered question as proof that the case could never be whole. Their argument was simple and powerful. You cannot convict someone based on what might have happened when too much of what did happen has been swallowed by years. Meanwhile, investigators continued working as if the case could still fall apart at any moment, because experience had taught them that confidence invites complacency, and complacency invites mistakes. They revisited the suspect's environment again, his habits, his routines, his changes over time, looking for continuity that might reveal something his words never would. They examined how he reacted under stress, how he handled scrutiny, how he adapted when pressure increased. Patterns emerged slowly, not dramatic, but persistent, the kind that only reveal themselves when watched long enough. The victim's absence became louder as the trial approached, a presence defined by everything that was no longer possible. Prosecutors worked carefully to keep the focus on who the victim had been, not as a symbol, not as a statistic, but as a person whose life had been interrupted without explanation. They knew the risk of overreach, of turning loss into spectacle, and they resisted it, choosing restraint over outrage, detail over drama. In a case like this, emotion could clarify, but it could also obscure. The suspect remained composed in public, his demeanor controlled, almost detached, as if distance were a form of defense. Privately, according to those who interacted with him, that control sometimes slipped, irritation bleeding through when questions circled too close to the past. Not anger, not panic, but something harder to define, a discomfort that suggested unresolved tension rather than shock. Detectives noted it quietly, aware that behavior alone proves nothing, but also aware that consistency has its own language. As jury selection began, the challenge of time became impossible to ignore. Potential jurors admitted they barely remembered the original case, if they remembered it at all. Others recalled fragments distorted by rumor and hindsight. Some expressed skepticism about cold cases entirely, doubting the reliability of anything that took 2 decades to surface. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike understood that persuasion would begin long before opening statements, and how they framed the very idea of delayed justice. Behind the scenes, last-minute issues surfaced, small technical questions that threatened to grow larger under scrutiny. Chain of custody documentation required careful explanation. Old evidence packaging raised concerns about contamination, about standards that had evolved beyond recognition. Experts prepared to testify not just about results, but about methods, about why those results mattered despite their age. The science was solid, but science alone does not convince. It must be translated into meaning jurors can grasp without feeling misled. The town watched closely, nerves stretched thin. For some, the trial represented long-awaited accountability, a chance to finally speak the victim's name without fear of it dissolving into silence. For others, it felt like an unsettling reminder that safety is never guaranteed, that familiarity can hide danger, that the past can reach forward without warning. Conversations grew cautious. People chose their words carefully, aware that opinions now carried weight they hadn't carried before. As opening day approached, investigators reflected privately on how far the case had traveled, not just through time, but through understanding. What had once seemed inexplicable now appeared tragically logical, shaped by choices, opportunities, and assumptions that aligned in a narrow window. That clarity did not bring satisfaction. It brought responsibility. Because understanding a crime does not lessen its impact, it sharpens it, forcing those who see it clearly to carry the burden of that knowledge. The suspect entered the courtroom under the gaze of cameras and strangers, his face familiar to some, anonymous to others, his presence a reminder that the distance between ordinary life and accusation can be frighteningly small. He pleaded not guilty, his voice steady, his posture controlled, his future suddenly defined by events he insisted he had nothing to do with. The words echoed through the room, colliding with 20 years of unanswered questions. As the trial prepared to begin, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. This was not a story about the past finally being put to rest. It was a story about the past refusing to stay quiet, about consequences delayed but not denied, about the uneasy realization that some answers arrive too late to heal, but too powerfully to ignore. And as the courtroom doors closed and the first witnesses prepared to speak, the Texas 2003 cold case stood on the edge of its most dangerous moment yet, where silence would finally be forced to compete with testimony, and where the outcome would shape not just a verdict, but the meaning of 20 years spent waiting for one. The courtroom settled into a tense stillness as the first witnesses took the stand, a silence thick with expectation, because this was the moment where theory met reality, where years of investigation would be tested not by instinct or belief, but by words spoken under oath. The prosecution moved deliberately, knowing that every sentence had to carry weight without appearing forced, that credibility would be built slowly, one careful step at a time. They began not with accusation, but with context, walking the jury back to a Texas summer when the heat clung to everything and the idea of a life simply vanishing felt unthinkable until it happened. They described the town as it was in 2003, smaller, less guarded, a place where doors were left unlocked and people assumed tomorrow would look much like today. They introduced the victim not as a tragedy, but as a presence, someone whose routines were known, whose absence had been immediately felt. Witnesses spoke of ordinary moments, conversations that seemed insignificant then, but now carried the gravity of finality. Each recollection added texture, anchoring the case in a reality the jury could imagine, a world before fear rewrote its rules. Then came the evidence, presented not as a revelation, but as an accumulation. The prosecution resisted the temptation to dramatize, letting experts explain what technology could and could not do, why something dismissed in 2003 carried meaning now. They spoke of probability, of thresholds, of the difference between coincidence and convergence. Jurors listened closely, some nodding, some skeptical, all aware that they were being asked to trust not just results, but the process that produced them. The defense countered with restraint of its own, questioning methods rather than motives, suggesting alternatives without fully endorsing them. They asked whether contamination could be ruled out, whether assumptions had crept in unnoticed, whether investigators, driven by the weight of time, had begun to see what they wanted to see. Their tone was measured, almost clinical, a reminder that doubt does not need to shout to be effective. As testimony continued, cracks in memory became apparent. Witnesses struggled to recall exact dates, exact words, exact times. The defense highlighted these gaps, turning uncertainty into a tool, while the prosecution reframed them as natural, inevitable, evidence not of deception but of human limitation. The jury watched this quiet battle unfold, learning that truth in a cold case rarely arrives whole, that it must be assembled from fragments that resist perfect alignment. Midway through the proceedings, the suspect took center stage without ever speaking, his past statements dissected, his timeline laid bare. Detectives testified about interviews conducted years apart, about subtle changes in phrasing, about details that shifted just enough to raise concern. The defense argued that memory evolves, that recollection adapts to new information, that consistency over decades is an unreasonable expectation. The prosecution responded by focusing on what had not changed, on the core elements that remained stable despite pressure and scrutiny. The victim's family sat through it all, faces composed, hands clenched, absorbing every word as if it might finally explain the silence they had lived with for so long. Their presence was a constant reminder that this case was not an abstract exercise, not an intellectual puzzle, but a story with real consequences, real loss, real damage that had never been repaired. The court maintained its distance, but the emotional undercurrent was impossible to ignore. As days passed, the jury began to see the shape of the case, not as a single line pointing unmistakably toward guilt, but as a narrowing field where alternatives gradually lost their footing. The prosecution emphasized opportunity, access, proximity, and behavior, weaving them together into a narrative that felt less like speculation and more like inevitability. The defense pushed back, insisting that inevitability is not proof, that certainty requires more than alignment. Tension peaked during cross-examinations, when experts were challenged on margins of error, on the limits of their conclusions. The courtroom leaned in as numbers and probabilities were debated, as confidence was tested. It was here that the case revealed its fragility, the recognition that one misinterpreted statistic, one poorly explained concept, could unravel months of preparation. Yet the testimony held, not perfectly, but sufficiently, refusing to collapse under pressure. Outside the courthouse, the town followed every update, conversations shaped by partial information, by headlines stripped of nuance. Some felt vindicated, convinced that justice was finally within reach. Others grew uneasy, troubled by the realization that certainty still felt elusive. The phrase cold case carried a different weight now, no longer a distant label, but an active force shaping daily life, reopening debates about trust, memory, and responsibility. As the prosecution rested its case, a quiet heaviness settled over the room. They had laid everything out, every piece they believed mattered, knowing there would be no second chance. The defense prepared to respond, not with a dramatic alternative theory, but with a reminder of absence, of what could not be proven, of the danger of filling gaps with assumption. They called their witnesses, experts who spoke of degradation, of uncertainty amplified by time, of the risk inherent in reaching backward for answers. The suspect remained largely expressionless, watching the process that now defined his future, his earlier confidence tempered by the reality unfolding around him. Whether innocent or guilty, he had become inseparable from the case, his name forever linked to a disappearance that refused to fade. The jury studied him carefully, aware of their own role in deciding not just his fate, but the story the town would tell itself moving forward. As closing arguments approached, the atmosphere grew heavier still. This was the point where evidence would be distilled into meaning, where complexity would be reduced to persuasion. The prosecution planned to emphasize patience, persistence, the idea that truth can survive even when buried for decades. The defense prepared to argue that doubt, once introduced, cannot be undone, that the absence of certainty is itself a verdict. Everyone involved understood that the outcome would not erase the past. No decision could return what was lost, or fully explain why it had taken so long to confront it. But as the courtroom braced for the final phase, one reality stood clear above all others. The Texas 2003 cold case had reached the moment it had been waiting for, where silence would finally be weighed against testimony, and where the long shadow of 20 years would be measured not in time, but in judgment. Closing arguments arrived without ceremony, no dramatic pause, no sense of relief, just a tightening of the room, as if everyone understood that what happened next would echo far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Because this was the moment when fragments were forced into meaning, when years of silence were distilled into a few carefully chosen words. The prosecution stood first, not raising their voice, not reaching for outrage, but speaking with a steady insistence that truth does not expire, that time may obscure, but it does not absolve. They asked the jury to consider not one piece of evidence, not one memory, But the convergence of all of it, the way separate lines, tested again and again, had refused to diverge. They spoke of opportunity and proximity, of a window of time that had never been convincingly closed, of behavior that made sense only when viewed through the lens of what followed. They acknowledged the years openly, naming the delay rather than hiding from it, arguing that progress in science and persistence in investigation were not weaknesses but strengths, proof that the case had waited for the truth to become visible. They reminded the jury that certainty does not always arrive with spectacle, that sometimes it arrives quietly, through the steady accumulation of facts that leave no reasonable place left to stand. The defense rose with a different energy, calm, controlled, deliberate, warning against the seductive power of narrative, against the human instinct to complete unfinished stories whether the evidence supports them or not. They spoke of erosion, of memory softened by time, of evidence handled by standards that no longer exist, of the danger of believing that alignment equals inevitability. They asked the jury to imagine the weight of 20 years pressing down on an investigation, shaping it, narrowing its focus, potentially blinding it to alternatives that could no longer be tested. They returned again and again to what was missing, to witnesses who could no longer speak, to records that no longer existed, to questions that would never be answered. They framed doubt not as obstruction, but as protection, the final safeguard against the irreversible act of conviction. Their message was simple and unsettling. If time has taken too much from this case, then time has taken too much to allow certainty. When the judge gave final instructions, the courtroom listened in near silence, the words heavy with consequence. Reasonable doubt, burden of proof. The definitions felt sharper now, no longer abstract principles, but tools the jury would soon have to wield. The jurors rose, filed out, and the doors closed behind them with a sound that lingered longer than it should have. Waiting is its own form of punishment. In the hours that followed, every movement felt amplified. The scrape of a chair, the hum of fluorescent lights, the whisper of fabric as someone shifted their weight. The victim's family sat together, hands linked, eyes forward, carrying a tension refined by decades of uncertainty. The suspect sat apart, guarded, his face betraying little, his posture rigid, as if stillness might offer some measure of control over what was coming. Outside, the town held its breath. News updates slowed, speculation intensified, and conversations fractured into whispers. Some were already convinced the outcome was inevitable. Others braced themselves for disappointment, fearing that after all this time, the case would collapse under the weight of its own history. No one could escape the sense that whatever the verdict, something fundamental was about to change. As night approached, the jury remained deliberating. Questions were sent back to the court, requests for clarification, for exhibits to be reviewed again. Each note triggered a ripple of reaction, hope flaring, doubt resurfacing, nerves tightening. The process was methodical, almost painfully so, a reminder that judgment, when taken seriously, resists haste. Behind closed doors, 12 people argued not just about facts, but about belief, about trust, about whether patients should be rewarded or punished. They weighed expert testimony against common sense, probability against intuition. They returned to that narrow window of time, that unresolved gap, asking whether it could carry the weight placed upon it. They debated whether consistency mattered more than completeness, whether absence of evidence was absence of truth or simply absence. Hours stretched into something indistinct. The past pressed forward, demanding resolution, while the present stalled, unwilling to rush toward a conclusion it could not undo. The concept of a cold case took on new meaning here, no longer defined by years, but by temperature, by the chill that settles when certainty remains just out of reach. When the jury finally sent word that they had reached a decision, the message traveled through the courthouse like a shockwave. People stood without realizing it. Breaths were held, eyes fixed on the door that separated deliberation from consequence. The suspect straightened slightly. The victim's family leaned in, bracing for impact. The jury filed back into the room, faces unreadable, movements synchronized by gravity rather than choice. The foreperson held the verdict form with both hands, as if to steady it. The judge asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear, and in that suspended moment before the answer, 20 years collapsed into a single breath, heavy with everything that had been lost, everything that had been postponed, everything that might finally be named. The foreperson's hands tremble just slightly as the paper is unfolded, a quiet sound in a room that has forgotten how to breathe, and for a split second everyone imagines the next words will land like a final gavel, clean and definitive, the kind of ending people can build a life around. But cold cases don't end cleanly, they don't respect neat conclusions, and the truth, when it finally steps into the light, often arrives fractured, incomplete, and sharp enough to cut in two directions at once. The judge's voice is calm, procedural, almost gentle, asking the question that has hung over this town since 2003, and the foreperson looks up, scanning faces that have waited 20 years to hear a single sentence that might finally make sense of the silence. We, the jury, the foreperson begins, and the courtroom tightens as if pulled by an invisible wire. The victim's family leaning forward, hands clasped so hard the knuckles pale, the suspect sitting still, jaw set, eyes fixed ahead, as if refusing to let the moment enter his body. The sentence stalls, not because the foreperson is uncertain, but because the words on that page do not deliver what everyone expected. There's a pause, a swallow, and then the phrase that breaks the room in a way no one rehearsed for. We are unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The sound that follows isn't a scream, isn't a sob, isn't even a gasp, it's worse. It's a sudden, collective collapse into confusion, a stunned intake of air like the entire building has been struck. The judge's expression remains controlled, but the eyes flicker, just for an instant, as if even the bench is disappointed. The prosecution goes rigid. The defense exhales slowly, not victory, not relief, but release from a pressure that was about to crush something irreversible. The victim's family doesn't move at first, as if the brain refuses to translate the words into meaning. 20 years, reopened. 20 years, reassembled. 20 years, and the moment arrives not with finality, but with uncertainty wearing a formal suit. The judge asks the foreperson to confirm, to clarify, to state whether further deliberation could change anything. The answer is careful but firm. They have tried, they have argued, they have reviewed evidence, requested exhibits, returned to testimony, and still the divide holds. The courtroom becomes a place where time is suddenly audible, ticking in the spaces between official phrases. The judge considers options, speaks of procedure, of instructions, of responsibility, and then declares what no one outside these walls ever wants to hear when a case is this old: mistrial. No verdict. No closure. Not today. A mistrial is not an ending, it is an unraveling. People imagine justice as a straight line, beginning with a crime and ending with a decision. But justice is often a maze, and a mistrial drops everyone back into the corridors with their flashlight batteries already half dead. The jurors are dismissed, faces strained, some looking guilty for what they could not do, others looking angry, as if the weight of the case tried to force them into certainty they did not feel. They file past the victim's family without making eye contact, past the suspect who now sits with a new kind of stillness, as though he has learned that freedom can feel like a different sort of confinement. Outside, the headlines move faster than the truth ever does. Hung jury. Mistrial. Texas 2003 cold case. Trial ends without verdict. The words are blunt, unsatisfying, built for speed rather than healing. Cameras catch reactions mid-expression, grief frozen into frames, frustration turned into sound bites. People who were not in the room speak like they were, constructing certainty from distance. The town, already divided, splits further because uncertainty is fertile soil for fear, and fear grows rumors like weeds. The victim's family steps out of the courthouse into a wall of microphones, lights, questions delivered with the urgency of entertainment. They speak with controlled tremor, thanking those who worked the case, expressing heartbreak, insisting they will not stop. They cannot stop, not after all these years. Their words are strong, but beneath them is something rawer, the recognition that they have just lived through a second disappearance. This time of certainty, of hope, of the belief that the past could finally be pinned down. They retreat to cars, to quiet spaces, to private grief that the public does not understand how to respect. The suspect's attorney speaks next, careful and polished, emphasizing doubt, emphasizing the jury's inability to convict, framing the outcome as proof that the case is built on assumptions and time-worn fragments. The suspect says little. He is escorted out with the same restraint he arrived with. But now the air around him feels different, charged, because in a town like this, a mistrial doesn't return you to innocence. It returns you to suspicion, and suspicion is a shadow that lengthens with every step. Inside the sheriff's office that night, the mood is heavy and sharp at the same time. There is no celebration, no relief, only a cold assessment of what happens next. Prosecutors must decide whether to retry, whether they can improve the case, whether the risk of a second failure is worth the effort, because a second mistrial is not just procedural, it is a message to the community that the system cannot finish what it started. Detectives rewatch testimony, looking for cracks, not in the story, but in how it was told. Was the science explained clearly enough? Were jurors lost in probability? Did the defense succeed in turning time into a weapon? Did the prosecution focus too hard on convergence and not enough on clarity? They speak in low voices about juror dynamics, about the split they can infer from what little is legally knowable. Was it one whole doubt? 2. Was doubt rooted in the evidence or in the idea of 20 years itself? Cold cases carry a particular kind of skepticism. People want truth, but they fear being asked to believe in something built from pieces that have survived too long. The detectives understand that fear. They live with it. But they also understand something else. The case did not collapse. It didn't fall apart under scrutiny. It held the room long enough to divide it, and division, in their world, means the story still has power. Then the calls begin. Reporters, community leaders, friends of the victim's family, strangers with tips, suddenly emboldened by the spectacle. And among the noise, there is a familiar pattern. After a high-profile moment, the human mind resorts old memories, dragging up details once dismissed. Someone remembers a vehicle. Someone remembers a comment said too casually at a barbecue in 2004. Someone remembers seeing the suspect in a place he swore he'd never been. Most of it will be nothing. Investigators know that. But cold cases are built on the willingness to sift through nothing until something sharp catches the light. A former witness calls late, voice shaking, saying they didn't testify because they didn't want to be involved, because they were scared, because they thought it was too late. But after watching the trial and hearing the mistrial, they can't sleep. Their memory is incomplete, their details fuzzy, yet there is a specific image they cannot shake. An argument overheard, a name spoken with anger, a phrase that sounds like a threat when replayed in the mind with 20 years of hindsight. Detectives listen without interrupting, writing notes, asking careful questions, understanding that fear can distort as much as it can reveal, but also knowing fear often forms around something real. Another call comes in from a neighboring county, an officer who read the headlines and recognized a name connected to an old report, not the victims, not the suspects, but someone adjacent, a person who brushed past the case in 2003 and never returned. A report that was minor then now looks like a thread. The detective on duty pulls the file, finds it buried in an archive system that has changed 3 times since the disappearance. The paper is yellowed at the edges. The facts are sparse, but the thread is there, and threads, in cold cases, are everything. Meanwhile, the suspect's world tilts under its own weight. Even if he walks free for now, the case follows him into every space. Stores, gas stations, parking lots. He can feel eyes, can hear whispers that cut off when he turns. People who once greeted him now avert their gaze. Supporters rally online, claiming vindication. Critics speak louder, insisting the mistrial proves only one thing. The truth is still loose. In a small Texas town, public opinion is its own court, and it does not require unanimity. The prosecutor meets with the victim's family in a quiet room away from cameras, explaining options, timelines, what a retrial would mean, what it would require from them, again. The family listens with the exhausted focus of people who have been taught to translate legal language into emotional survival. They ask the question that cuts beneath procedure. Do you still believe it was him? The prosecutor doesn't answer with certainty, because certainty is what failed in that courtroom, but they answer with resolve. They believe the evidence matters. They believe the case is not over. They believe time should not win by default. And still, the haunting truth remains. Even if the suspect is guilty, even if a future jury convicts, there are parts of this story that may never be recovered. Cold cases often leave gaps that no verdict can fill. A motive that stays private. A final moment no one witnessed. A missing piece of physical proof that the land swallowed years ago. The town wants an ending, but it may only get a verdict, and a verdict is not the same thing. On the drive home that night, a detective passes the stretch of road where the case began, where the air once seemed ordinary before it turned into a crime scene. The headlights sweep across dark fields that look endless, and in that moving cone of light, the detective feels the case like a pressure behind the ribs, a reminder that a mistrial is not failure, but it is not victory either. It is the cold case breathing again, refusing to settle, refusing to be quiet, insisting on one brutal reality. After 20 years, the past has finally been dragged into the present, and now the present has to decide whether it has the strength to carry it to the end. The next morning, the town wakes up to the same sun, the same routines, but nothing feels restored. People talk about it the way they talked about it in 2003, half certain, half afraid, full of questions. Cold case reopened. Suspect caught. No verdict. The words don't fit together neatly, and that mismatch becomes the new wound, fresh and tender, because the case was supposed to end with an answer, and instead it ended with a door left cracked open, darkness visible through the gap, daring everyone to look in again. The days after the mistrial feel like the aftermath of a storm that never fully hit land, just hovered overhead, rattling windows, flooding nerves, leaving everything damp with tension and unfinished business. The town tries to return to its routines, but routine is brittle now. People flinch at headlines. Conversations stop mid-sentence when a police cruiser rolls by. The words, Texas 2003 cold case, don't fade. They multiply, turning into a constant hum, a reminder that the past is not behind them. It's beside them, breathing in the same air. Inside the prosecutor's office, the mistrial is treated like a diagnosis, not a defeat. They dissect it with cold precision, reviewing witness order, exhibit timing, juror questions, every moment where attention might have drifted, every phrase that might have planted doubt. The goal is not to feel better. The goal is to understand the fracture. Because if the case is retried, it has to land cleaner, sharper, with less room for a single holdout to anchor the whole room in uncertainty. Detectives go back into the field, because once a trial ends without verdict, the case becomes vulnerable again, and vulnerability is invitation. People who stayed silent before now feel brave enough to speak, or frightened enough to speak, because the public spotlight changes what secrecy costs. A cold case reopened is like shaking a locked box. Whatever was settled inside starts shifting, and sometimes something loose finally falls into view. They start with the calls that came in after the mistrial, tips scribbled on notepads, voice messages saved and replayed, names that weren't on the board before. Most are thin, some are wrong, but one stands out. A witness who remembers a vehicle near the abandoned car in 2003, not a clear plate, not a perfect description, but a detail about damage, something hanging loose, a dent shaped like a crescent, an image that has lived in the witness's head like a stain. In 2003, it meant nothing. Now it is a thread that can be pulled. Investigators run it through what they have: old repair records, insurance claims, body shop receipts, any trace of a vehicle matching that description in the suspect's orbit at the time. The search is slow, messy, because records weren't built to survive 20 years of digital migration. Yet patience is the currency of cold cases. They find something, not a perfect match, but a repair invoice from months after the disappearance, vague language, a rear panel fix, no narrative, just a line item and a date. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't even guarantee it's related. But it puts a pin in a timeline that once had too many blank spaces. Then the detectives go back to the suspect's circle, not just friends and family, but the overlooked edges, co-workers who drifted away, acquaintances who were too peripheral to matter back then, people who might have carried a small piece of the story without realizing it. Time has changed relationships. Old loyalties have weakened. People who once protected him, if there was anything to protect, are older now, tired, more willing to unburden themselves. Investigators know this and move carefully, because squeezing too hard can turn fragile truth into defensive fiction. One interview lands differently. A former coworker, voice low, says something that makes the room go still. There was talk back then, not official talk, not anything that reached police reports, but talk in break rooms and parking lots. A rumor that the suspect had a problem, that he was mad about something, that he was worried she'd talk. The coworker insists they never took it seriously, that everyone said things when they were angry, that it was just noise. But the phrase worried she'd talk hits like a knife, because it suggests motive, leverage, fear, an emotional engine that could explain why a disappearance might have been engineered rather than accidental. Detectives press gently. What did talk mean? About what? To who? The coworker hesitates, says they don't know, but mentions a name, someone the victim had been seen with, someone known for being close enough to cause gossip and distant enough to avoid suspicion. Investigators add the name to the board, and the board begins to look less like a straight line and more like a web. The prosecutors weigh the new material, but they also understand the danger. Adding threads can strengthen a case, but it can also complicate it, and jurors drown in complication. The retrial, if it happens, must be cleaner, not messier. So they ask the detectives for what matters most. Something concrete, something that turns atmosphere into evidence. The detectives understand the assignment. They go back to the one thing cold cases fear and love at the same time: physical proof. Old evidence is retested again, not because they expect a miracle, but because science has a way of offering surprises when it's asked the same question with better tools. A lab technician opens sealed packaging with careful hands, documenting every step, aware that defense attorneys will attack the process as much as the result. Swabs, fibers, trace material, items that once yielded nothing but frustration now become candidates for new analysis. One result comes back not as a smoking gun, but as a direction, a partial profile, a secondary contact, something that indicates the victim interacted with someone else in a way that wasn't accounted for. It doesn't clear the suspect. It doesn't convict him, but it expands the universe, forcing investigators to confront the possibility that the story is more complex than the trial presented. The defense will seize on it as doubt. The prosecution sees it as an opportunity. If they can explain it, control it, define it, it could actually strengthen their narrative by showing thoroughness rather than avoidance. The town reacts with predictable chaos. Some people interpret the new testing as proof the suspect is being railroaded. Others see it as proof he's guilty, and investigators are finally closing in. Social media turns small developments into certainty within minutes, and certainty becomes a weapon used to shame, to pressure, to polarize. The case becomes less about evidence and more about identity. What side you're on, who you trust, what you believe about law enforcement, about the courts, about time itself. The victim's family tries to exist in the middle of that noise, but it's impossible. Their lives become public property again. Their grief reopened like a wound forced to breathe air it can't tolerate. They receive messages from strangers claiming to know the truth. They receive threats. They receive prayers. They receive theories. Every notification becomes a potential trigger. Yet they keep showing up, because showing up is all they have left, the one thing time hasn't taken from them: the ability to refuse silence. Behind closed doors, the suspect meets with his attorney, and the conversation is not about innocence in the philosophical sense, but about survival. A retrial would mean the spotlight again. Another jury. Another chance for the state to sharpen its case. Another chance for a mistake to become fatal. The attorney advises caution, suggests strategy, considers whether to negotiate, whether to gamble. The suspect insists he will not plead, not because he believes the state can't win, but because pleading would be admitting that 20 years of living under the radar was not ordinary life, it was escape. As weeks pass, investigators focus on the weakest point from the first trial: the jury's inability to unify. They try to infer where the split happened, what evidence persuaded some, but not all. They replay the defense's strongest moments, the way they weaponized time, the way they suggested contamination, the way they planted the idea that a cold case is inherently less trustworthy. Prosecutors plan to counter that more directly next time, to confront skepticism head-on rather than hoping evidence will overpower it. And then, as if the case senses it is losing momentum, something new arrives. unexpected, sharp, destabilizing. A person comes forward with a story they have never told police, not in 2003, not in the years after, not even during the trial, because they believed it was safer to keep it buried. Their voice shakes as they speak, and the first words out of their mouth are not facts but confession. I should have said something. I didn't. I was scared. They describe a night years ago, a conversation overheard, a moment where the suspect's mask slipped, where anger rose, where he said something that sounded like a threat, something that sounded like consequence. The witness cannot provide perfect dates. They cannot provide recordings. They can only provide the memory itself, raw and unsettling, the kind of memory that doesn't fade because it was never safe enough to forget. Detectives listen, writing, asking, clarifying, aware that this could be nothing, could be distortion, could be the mind filling gaps after seeing headlines, but also aware that this kind of delayed confession is exactly how cold cases sometimes crack open. People do not always come forward when truth is fresh. They come forward when truth becomes unbearable to carry alone. The statement is taken. The witness signs. The process begins. Corroboration, verification, cross-checking. Because a story is not evidence until it can survive contact with reality. Investigators search for anything that can anchor the claim. Phone records, calendars, old messages, other witnesses who might confirm the same moment. It is slow work, the kind that breaks people down in quiet ways, but it is necessary because the retrial, if it comes, will not forgive exaggeration. It will punish it. As the case shifts again, the central truth becomes clearer. The mistrial did not cool the case. It heated it. It forced movement. It triggered memory. It shook loose threads that were previously stuck. A cold case reopened is not just a legal event. It is a psychological earthquake, and earthquakes reveal buried things, sometimes bones, sometimes secrets, sometimes lies. And in Texas, as the season turns and the air changes, the town realizes something unsettling. The trial that failed to deliver a verdict may have been only the first collision between the past and the present. The real impact may still be ahead, waiting in evidence retested, witnesses awakened, and a story that is no longer content to remain unfinished. The decision to retry doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like a stamp on paper, quiet and bureaucratic. But the moment it becomes public, the town reacts as if someone has struck a match in a room full of fumes. Because a second trial means the past isn't just resurfacing. It's coming back with purpose, with sharper teeth, with the promise that this time the silence will be forced to choose a side. The headline writes itself before anyone speaks. Texas 2003 cold case retrial set. Prosecutors vow justice after hung jury, and the phrase cold case starts moving again through the community like weather, unavoidable, pressing against every door and window. Behind the scenes, the prosecutors don't talk about vengeance, they talk about precision. They strip the case down to its skeleton and rebuild it with fewer distractions, less narrative drift, more clarity. They are not trying to win a story contest. They are trying to remove oxygen from doubt. Every witness is reevaluated, not for how compelling they are, but for how stable they remain under cross-examination. Every exhibit is tested again, not just in a lab, but in a courtroom simulation. Can 12 strangers understand it, trust it, carry it without confusion? The prosecution's new mantra is simple and ruthless: no dead weight, because dead weight sinks cold cases faster than missing evidence ever could. Detectives keep working in parallel because they've learned a hard lesson from the mistrial. The case can be strong and still fail if it doesn't land in the minds of jurors the way it needs to. They chase corroboration for the late-coming witness who admitted fear and silence, because that kind of testimony can either become a turning point or a disaster. They track down anyone who might confirm the setting of the overheard conversation, the gathering, the place, the people present, the weather, the soundtrack of ordinary life around an extraordinary statement. They dig through old phone logs that barely qualify as records, old pay stubs, old photographs with timestamps that might anchor memory to reality. The work is tedious, unforgiving, and necessary, because in a retrial, the defense won't just attack the witness. They'll attack the very idea that a memory can mature into truth. The defense, for their part, smells opportunity in the cracks left by the first trial. They prepare to do what they did before, only cleaner, sharper, more aggressive. Their strategy isn't to prove an alternative story. Alternatives get messy. They want to prove that certainty is impossible. They plan to hammer the same drum until it drowns everything else. 20 years, degraded evidence, faded memory, investigative bias, reasonable doubt. They want the jury to feel the weight of time like a hand on the back of the neck, pushing them away from conviction even if they believe the suspect might be capable. In a cold case, might be is the defense's oxygen. Then the new lab results, those partial, secondary traces, become a battlefield. The prosecution cannot ignore them. The defense cannot wait to weaponize them. Because a secondary profile is more than a scientific footnote, it's a doorway, and doorways invite jurors to imagine someone else walking through. Prosecutors meet with their experts and decide on a dangerous approach. They will address it directly, early, confidently, explaining what it does and does not mean. They will not let the defense introduce it as a surprise, as a crack in the foundation. They will frame it as the natural outcome of thorough retesting in a case this old, and then they will tighten the focus again. The suspect remains the center of gravity. The secondary trace is a distraction unless it can be tied to a known, explainable contact. If they can explain it, it stops being doubt. It becomes proof of transparency. The detectives, however, cannot treat it as mere theater. They have to chase it, because their job is not to win arguments, it's to find truth. They run it through every database and registry they're allowed to use. They map it against anyone connected to the victim's last days. Anyone who could plausibly have left a trace without being the perpetrator. Co-workers, friends, family, first responders, volunteers from searches, lab techs from early handling. The list is long and uncomfortable because it forces them to consider not just suspects, but the entire ecosystem of human contact around the case. And then, late one evening, a result comes back that does not deliver certainty, but delivers shock. The partial profile produces a tentative link, an association, not an identification, connected to someone who shouldn't be anywhere near this story anymore. A name from the periphery, a person who was briefly mentioned in early reports and then forgotten. Not the suspect, not the victim, someone adjacent, like a shadow near the edge of the frame, suddenly stepping closer. The detectives don't celebrate. They don't even speak for a moment, because they know what a development like this can mean. It can strengthen the case by explaining the secondary trace, or it can blow the case open, forcing everyone to confront the possibility that they have been staring at the wrong center for 20 years, and that the arrest, the trial, the mistrial, the retrial, all of it, might be orbiting the wrong sun. They move quietly. They pull the old peripheral names history. They discover the person left the area years ago, bounced between counties, changed jobs, changed addresses. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal on paper, just a life in motion, which can mean innocence or avoidance depending on who is reading the file. They locate an old contact who remembers something uncomfortable, a disagreement, a strange boast, a comment that felt like a joke until it didn't. The detectives write it down because cold cases are built from comments people once laughed off. Now the prosecution faces a nightmare scenario. What if the defense learns first? What if the defense spins this into an alternate suspect story, not because they believe it, but because it fractures focus? Prosecutors meet again, closed door, urgent, voices low. They ask detectives whether this new peripheral thread can be resolved quickly. Can it be explained as harmless contact? Can it be ruled out? Or does it open a door they cannot close? The detectives won't lie. They say the truth. They don't know yet. And don't know yet is dangerous in a case preparing for retrial. So the prosecutors make a choice. They move forward anyway, but with contingency. They narrow the story they will tell. They refine the themes. They sharpen the timeline. They put the suspect back at the center with even more emphasis on opportunity and inconsistency. And they plan to acknowledge the secondary trace in a controlled way, offering the jury an explanation that does not invite them to run wild. In their view, the case is still strong. In their view, the new thread is either noise or something that can be folded into the existing narrative without breaking it. But in cold cases, folded in can become torn open, with one unpredictable witness on a stand. The victim's family is briefed, because by now they have earned the right to know what the system is doing with their grief. In a private room, Prosecutors explain that a retrial is coming, that the case remains focused on the same suspect, that new testing has produced new information that is being investigated. The family listens with the guarded posture of people who have learned that hope can injure. Their faces don't brighten. They don't collapse. They do something harder. They absorb it, file it away, and ask the one question that never changes. Are we closer to the truth or just closer to another headline? Outside that room, the town continues to turn the case into its own mythology. Some people say the mistrial proved the suspect is innocent. Others say the mistrial proved the jury was weak. Some now seize on whispers about new evidence and declare the investigation corrupt. Others claim it's finally expanding in the right direction. The phrase cold case becomes a weapon in every argument, a shorthand for everything people fear about justice. Too slow, too late, too uncertain, too human. Then something else happens, something smaller than lab results, but sometimes bigger in impact. A person close to the suspect stops returning calls. A friend, a relative, someone who had been supportive. The detectives notice because patterns matter. They track the person down and find hesitation where there used to be confidence. The person doesn't accuse, not directly, but they say something that lands like ice in the stomach. They never thought about the timing before, never checked calendars, never compared notes, but now they can't reconcile where the suspect claimed to be with where they remember him being. It isn't a dramatic betrayal. It's a quiet fracture, the kind that can widen. The defense senses the shift, too. They tighten their own circle, warn their client to speak less, to stay calm, to let the system carry the burden. They prepare motions to exclude the late witness testimony, arguing it is unreliable, tainted by media exposure, unfairly prejudicial. They push to challenge every forensic method, every chain of custody link, every moment where 2003 standards differ from today's. Their strategy is to turn the trial into a referendum on time, not a judgment of a person. If the jury can be made to distrust the past, they won't convict in the present. And through it all, the case keeps doing what cold cases do best. It refuses to be simple. The suspect is still the suspect, still in the center, still the name in every headline. Yet now the edges are moving, whispering, threatening to reshape the frame. The secondary trace, the peripheral name, the late witness, the cracked loyalty, each element is a match held too close to dry paper. On the eve of the retrial's scheduling conference, a detective sits alone with the file, old pages and new reports spread across a desk like a map of time. He understands something that no headline ever captures. This isn't just one story. It's a layered disaster of missed moments, human error, and delayed technology. And somewhere inside it is a truth that has survived every attempt to bury it. The problem is that survival is not the same as visibility. The truth might be there. The question is whether the system can still make it seen. As dawn approaches, the detective closes the file and feels that familiar, unsettling certainty of cold cases. The closer you get to an answer, the more the case tests you. It offers you a suspect, then offers you a shadow. It gives you evidence, then gives you ambiguity. It pulls you forward with the promise of resolution, then reminds you that resolution and truth are not always the same thing. And in Texas, as the retrial draws near and the town braces for another collision with its own past, the cold case remains exactly what it has always been, an open wound disguised as a file, waiting to see whether the next time the jury returns, it will bring an ending or a deeper kind of mystery. The second time the courthouse fills, it feels different, not louder, not bigger, but tighter, as if everyone learned from the mistrial that certainty is not guaranteed and hope is not safe. And the air carries that knowledge like static, snapping at every whispered conversation, every shuffled footstep, every camera lens turning toward the same faces again. The victim's family arrives early and sits in the same place, because when a life has been frozen in an unfinished sentence for 20 years, repetition becomes ritual, and ritual becomes armor. The suspect appears at the defense table with the same controlled posture, but control looks thinner now, stretched across a longer span of time than anyone was meant to endure under suspicion, and he stares forward as if eye contact might invite the past to speak. The prosecution begins with fewer flourishes and more spine, cutting cleanly through the background, the weather, the nostalgia, and going straight to what they want the jury to feel in their bones. This is not a story built from wishful thinking. This is a story built from convergence, from the way certain facts refuse to separate no matter how time tries to pull them apart. They explain, early and blunt, why this case is here now and not in 2003, because they know the defense will use delay like a blade, and they refuse to let the blade be hidden. Technology changed. Databases expanded. Methods sharpened. And when those changes collided with evidence that had waited in storage for 2 decades, a door opened that could not be closed again. The defense watches without blinking, prepared for the same war they fought the first time, only meaner, only cleaner, because they've already seen the prosecution's rhythm and they know exactly where the jury's attention can be made to wobble. They don't need to prove another killer. They only need to make the idea of a single killer feel unsafe. They need time to feel like fog, not like distance. They need the jury to feel that the past cannot be held firmly enough to justify the weight of a verdict. The first witnesses return with the familiar struggle of memory, voices older, hands shaking around water cups, eyes darting toward the ceiling as if details might still be stored somewhere above them. The prosecution moves them quickly, pulling only what matters, the last known routines, the first moment someone realized the victim was missing, the abandoned car, the way the town's comms snapped into fear. The defense presses on every uncertainty, every I think, every maybe, every forgotten timestamp, because doubt grows best in small spaces, and cold cases are full of them. Then the forensic testimony arrives like a hinge in the story, the quiet machinery of science brought into a room hungry for narrative, and the prosecution handles it differently this time, not letting it drift into numbers without meaning, not letting the jury drown in probability. They explain what the evidence is, how it was preserved, how it was tested, what it can prove, and what it cannot. They explain the standards of then and now, the chain of custody, the safeguards, the way modern analysis can extract signal from what used to be noise. The defense pushes hard, as expected, asking about degradation, contamination, human handling, the inevitability of error in anything touched by 2 decades of time. But the experts hold steady, their language careful, their confidence measured, refusing to oversell, refusing to crack under cross-examination. And then the prosecution does something dangerous on purpose. They introduce the secondary trace early, the fragment that could become a doorway for doubt if the defense is allowed to frame it first. They don't hide it. They don't minimize it. They explain it as part of the reality of old evidence, the reality of contact, the reality of a case that lived through searches, volunteers, early handling, and the messy humanity that always surrounds trauma. They offer a plausible explanation tied to known, documented interactions, and they anchor that explanation with the kind of paperwork juries can understand, logs, reports, established procedures. So the secondary trace doesn't become mystery, it becomes the cost of dealing with history. But the defense smiles anyway, because they can feel where the fault line still is. In a retrial, the prosecution can control the order of information, but they can't control what jurors feel when they hear someone else. The defense doesn't need that someone else to be real. They only need it to exist in the jury's imagination. Then the late-coming witness takes the stand, the person who said they stayed silent out of fear, and the courtroom shifts, because fear is a language everyone understands, and delayed truth carries its own kind of gravity. The witness speaks carefully, not theatrically, describing an overheard moment from years ago, describing tone, anger, the shape of a statement that sounded like consequence. The prosecution keeps it tight, drawing out only what can be repeated without embellishment. The defense goes after it like a storm, attacking timing, attacking exposure to media, attacking the reliability of memory that has had years to firm it, suggesting that the witness is unconsciously rewriting the past to fit a headline. The witness holds, but holding is not the same as winning. The jury watches with that particular expression of modern skepticism, the look of people who want to believe in courage but fear being tricked by narrative. And in the middle of all this tension, as the days stack and the case begins to feel like it might actually land this time, the peripheral thread, quiet until now, starts to breathe. It's not introduced as an alternate suspect, not directly, but as an investigative reality the defense insists should have been pursued harder. They imply, without naming it too loudly, that law enforcement chose a target and stopped looking. The prosecution responds with controlled frustration, emphasizing that the investigation did continue, that the thread is being assessed, that nothing in it eclipses the suspect's proximity, opportunity, and inconsistencies. The judge allows limited questioning, carefully, because this is where retrials can spiral into chaos, and chaos is exactly what the defense wants. The courtroom becomes a balancing act on a wire. Every time the prosecution tightens focus, the defense shakes the line. Every time the defense introduces fog, the prosecution tries to shine through it. The victim's family sits through each exchange like people watching waves hit a shore they built their lives on, because every motion in that room threatens to reshape the coastline of their grief. Then, late in the second week, something happens that no one can script and no attorney can fully control. A new filing appears, not from the defense, not from the prosecution, but from the lab, an administrative correction, a chain of custody clarification, a minor discrepancy that on paper looks small, almost harmless, but in a cold case, small things are grenades. A date entered incorrectly years ago, a transfer logged under the wrong initials, a seal number that doesn't match on one sheet, but does on another. It doesn't mean the evidence is invalid. It doesn't mean contamination occurred, but it gives the defense a lever, and they use it immediately, arguing that if the state cannot account perfectly for the path evidence traveled across 20 years, then the jury has no business treating that evidence as rock solid. The prosecution counters, showing that the discrepancy is clerical, that the physical integrity of the evidence remained intact, that the documentation elsewhere supports continuity. Experts explain how such errors can occur without affecting the sample itself. But the harm isn't only technical. The harm is psychological. The jury has been asked to believe the past can be handled cleanly enough to convict someone in the present, and now they've watched the past wobble on the page. The judge calls a brief recess. People stand, stretch, whisper. The suspect leans toward his attorney, the conversation hidden by the angle of his hand. The victim's family stares straight ahead, faces hardening with the recognition of a familiar pattern. Whenever the truth starts to feel close, something slips. When court resumes, the prosecution keeps moving, refusing to let the discrepancy become the story, and for a while it works. Witnesses continue. Timelines tighten. The suspect's prior statements are read again, and the small shifts, the careful corrections, the adjusted details, sound louder now in a room trained to listen for instability. The defense insists those shifts are human. The prosecution insists they are telling. The jury takes notes like people writing down weather patterns before deciding whether to trust the forecast. Closing arguments arrive again, and this time they sound less like speeches and more like collisions. The prosecution speaks of patience, persistence, and a truth that waited for the world to become capable of seeing it. They speak of the victim's absence as a fact that doesn't change, and they ask the jury to refuse the idea that time itself is a shield. The defense speaks of irreversible consequences, of the danger of convicting based on a story assembled from pieces that have been handled, moved, forgotten, and resurrected. They remind jurors that beyond a reasonable doubt is not a phrase meant to comfort the grieving. It is a barrier meant to protect the living from error. And then the jury leaves again, and the room becomes a museum of suspended breath. Hours pass, then a full day, then another. The court receives notes, requests to review exhibits, to rehear testimony, to clarify technical definitions. Each note lands like a pulse, telling everyone the jury is still alive in deliberation, still wrestling, still split. Outside, reporters speculate. Inside, people measure time by coffee refills and the creak of chairs. The victim's family holds hands so tightly it looks painful. The suspect stares at the same spot on the table as if he can drill through it into something safer. On the third afternoon, the jury sends a final note, and the judge's face changes slightly before it's even read aloud, a shift that tells those who have lived through trials what is coming. The note is brief. The meaning is enormous. They cannot reach unanimity. A second hung jury is not just disappointment. It is a rupture. It tells the town that the past is too tangled to be pinned down by 12 people in one room. It tells the victim's family that the system can bring them to the edge of an answer and still leave them standing there alone. It tells the suspect that freedom, if it comes, will never feel clean because suspicion has already moved into the walls of his life. The judge declares another mistrial, and the words fall into the room like cold rain. The prosecution's shoulders stiffen as if absorbing impact. The defense exhales again, not triumph, but the grim relief of a job done. The victim's family does not cry loudly. Loud grief belongs to fresh wounds. This is older than loud. This is the quiet, shaking kind, the kind that makes a person look at the world and realize it has no obligation to make sense. In the weeks that follow, prosecutors face the decision no headline can soften. Try again and risk a third failure. Risk turning the case into a public wound that never closes. Or stop and let the case return to the shelf, not solved, not resolved, just waiting like it did before. They consult. They argue. They review what they can improve. They consider whether the evidence will ever get cleaner than it is right now, whether witnesses will ever get younger than they are right now, whether the next jury will be any less haunted by the shadow of time than the last two. And eventually, a statement is released, carefully worded, heavy with restraint. The state is not dismissing the case forever, but it is pausing active prosecution pending further developments. The suspect walks out of the courtroom a free man for the moment, not cleared, not absolved, just released into a world that has already decided he belongs to the cold case, whether the law can prove it or not. He returns to streets that feel narrower now, to glances that linger too long, to an existence where every ordinary day is tinted by an extraordinary accusation. The victim's family returns home to the same empty chair, the same missing voice, the same calendar that keeps moving forward without permission. And somewhere in an evidence room, under fluorescent lights that never turn off, the box goes back onto the shelf. The label is still there. Texas 2003, cold case. The ink looks darker than it used to, as if the words have absorbed 20 years of breath and fear. The file is thicker now, heavier with modern reports and courtroom transcripts, heavier with attempts, heavier with near answers. It sits beside other boxes that also failed to become endings. On certain nights, when the town is quiet and the roads stretch out under a blank Texas sky, people still drive past that place where the first clue was found, where the victim's routine broke and never repaired itself. The fields look the same. The darkness looks the same. But the air feels different, because now everyone knows what they didn't know back then. Sometimes you can reopen a cold case, catch a suspect after 20 years, drag the past into the harshest light available, and still not force it to confess. Sometimes the mystery doesn't survive because it is clever. It survives because time is, and time doesn't care who deserves peace. The town carries the story forward like a weight passed hand to hand. The victim's name remains spoken in certain houses, in certain prayers, in certain conversations that end abruptly when someone realizes they're saying it out loud again. The suspect's name remains spoken too, lower, sharper, wrapped in argument. The truth, wherever it is, stays just beyond reach, not gone, not safe, not silent, simply waiting in the dark margins between what can be proven and what can be felt. And that is the final cruelty of a cold case. It does not always end with a verdict. Sometimes it ends with a community learning how to live beside an open question, how to lock their doors a little earlier, how to watch the road a little longer, how to hear a phone ring at 2:17 a.m. and feel the past rise inside them like a second heartbeat. Because somewhere out there, beyond the courthouse and the headlines, the unfinished story is still breathing. And the only thing colder than the evidence is the realization that the answer might be close and still never arrive.